The greatest empire in human history was not built by soldiers marching under a banner, but by a quiet bureaucratic heist that forced the rest of the world to buy its own paper. But behind the curtain of this global dominance, the dollar was never a shield. It was a saw. A jagged two-sided blade that sliced through foreign sovereign treasuries while slowly hollowing out the nation that forged it. How did a bankrupt republic, which began its journey with a currency so worthless it became a national punchline, manage to turn its paper debt into a global saw that conquered every market on Earth? And what happens when that same blade finally turns inward to slice through the very foundation of the American empire itself? To understand how the dollar began its conquest, we must look at a moment when European civilization believed it was fighting for its very soul. In the autumn of 1914, the fields of France and Belgium turned into industrialized slaughterhouses. The political rhetoric from London and Paris was glorious. They were defending democracy, honor, and empire. Yet behind this patriotic theater, a cold financial transaction was taking place. The British and French war machines required millions of tons of steel, gunpowder, and grain, and the primary supplier was a neutral United States. But Washington was not operating a charity. The United States demanded payment in physical gold. As millions died on the Western Front, British and French cargo ships were quietly sailing across the Atlantic, their holds packed with heavy wooden crates containing the gold reserves of European central banks. To transport this immense wealth, the British Navy launched a covert operation codenamed Operation Fish, loading thousands of gold bars onto heavily armed battleships that braved German U-boat-infested waters. The gold was delivered straight to the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Lower Manhattan. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the geopolitical balance of power had shifted permanently. Europe emerged victorious on paper, but completely hollowed out, carrying billions of dollars in sovereign debt. The United States, meanwhile, had accumulated more than 40% of the world's physical gold reserves. New York had replaced London as the world's financial capital, not through military conquest, but through a silent liquidation of European gold. The glorious rhetoric of the Allied victory masked a harsh ledger. Europe had traded its physical wealth for American artillery shells. The very metal that had backed European currencies for centuries now sat in American vaults, leaving the old world dependent on American credit to rebuild. By the spring of 1933, the global financial system was frozen, and the United States faced economic collapse. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered a message of hope and collective sacrifice. The public was told that to save the banking system, everyone had to pull together. The executive order signed that day, numbered 6102, was framed as a patriotic duty. The reality was a state-sponsored confiscation of private wealth. Under Executive Order 6102, the United States government criminalized the private ownership of physical gold coins, bullion, and certificates. This decree applied to every individual, partnership, association, and corporation, forcing them to hand over their physical sovereignty under penalty of law. American citizens were ordered to deliver their personal gold holdings to the Federal Reserve in exchange for $20.67 in paper currency per ounce. Refusal was met with a $10,000 fine and 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The public complied, handing over their life savings in exchange for paper promises. Once the physical gold was locked inside the vaults of Fort Knox, the state executed the second part of the maneuver. In January 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act, which instantly revalued gold to $35 per ounce. The paper dollars the citizens had received were devalued by 41% overnight. By changing a single number on the ledger, the president transferred billions of dollars in purchasing power from the citizens' pockets directly to the government's balance sheet, creating an artificial accounting profit of $2.8 billion for the U.S. Treasury. The federal government had written down its own domestic debt by nearly half, paying off its obligations in paper it had just stripped of value, while the gold it held was worth 41% more on its balance sheet. The citizens cheered their relief, unaware that their wealth had been extracted to fund the state. This domestic mechanism was soon scaled up to encompass the entire globe. In April 1948, President Harry Truman signed the Foreign Assistance Act, launching the Marshall Plan. The public narrative was one of pure humanitarian benevolence. $17 billion in aid to rebuild Europe and protect the free world from Soviet expansion. But the financial plumbing was designed with a silent, permanent catch. The billions in aid were never delivered as free cash. The funding was structurally locked. Under the rules established by the Economic Cooperation Administration, European nations did not receive direct dollar deposits. Instead, they received credits that had to be spent directly on American goods, shipped on American vessels, and invoiced exclusively in dollars. Beyond this, they had to establish matching funds in their own domestic currencies, called counterpart funds, which were monitored by American administrators, ensuring that no European government could make a major sovereign spending decision without Washington's explicit approval. The humanitarian gift was a sophisticated dollar-seeding heist. By forcing European nations to rebuild their supply chains around American machinery and fuel, Washington created a permanent global demand for its currency. To keep their factories running, European nations had to trade using the dollar as their primary medium of exchange. The dollar had conquered Europe's trade routes, not by proving its stability, but by making itself the only currency that could buy survival. By the late 1960s, the United States had reached the zenith of its global power. The world watched in awe as American astronauts landed on the moon in July 1969, a glorious display of technological and cultural supremacy. At the same time, President Lyndon Johnson was launching his Great Society programs while waging a massive, high-tech war in Vietnam. The rhetoric of Washington was that a superpower could afford both guns and butthursts, that American resources were infinite. But the federal ledger was hemorrhaging. To fund both the war in Southeast Asia and the expanding welfare state without raising taxes, the United States printed trillions of unbacked dollars, exporting inflation. Foreign governments began to notice that the number of paper dollars circulating globally far exceeded the physical gold backing them at the Federal Reserve. The gold coverage ratio had dropped to critical levels. To maintain the illusion of the $35 peg, Washington had organized a secret consortium in November 1961 called the London Gold Pool. 8 Western central banks, including the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, agreed to pool their gold reserves to suppress the market price of gold in London. If the price rose above $35, the pool would dump physical gold to force it back down. By March 1968, the pool was collapsing. Investors and foreign central banks, realizing the dollar was debased, rushed to trade paper for physical metal. In a single week, the pool lost hundreds of tons of gold. The London Gold Pool was abandoned and the price of gold began to climb. While the public was distracted by the geopolitical theater of the Cold War, the monetary system was in terminal decline. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign governments. The suspension became permanent. The United States had unilaterally defaulted on its promises. The world's reserve currency was backed by nothing but a promise that had been broken. Today, the United States remains the undisputed administrator of global finance, policing the world under the banner of the rules-based international order. The geopolitical arena is dominated by the rhetoric of democratic solidarity and financial security. In 2022, when global conflict erupted, Washington led a coalition to freeze over $300 billion of Russian central bank assets, demonstrating the power of the SWIFT network to cut any nation out of the economy. It was celebrated as a masterstroke of bloodless warfare. But this geopolitical triumph has activated the terminal phase of the heist. By proving that sovereign reserves are only safe if a nation remains aligned with Washington's foreign policy, the United States Treasury has weaponized its currency to its own detriment. Central banks across the developing world have recognized the warning. A stampede into physical gold has begun. In 2023, global central banks purchased a record 1,037 tons of gold, seeking an asset that cannot be frozen by an administrative order. At the same time, the domestic home front is cracking. The U.S. national debt has surged past $35 trillion, with interest payments alone costing over $1 trillion annually, exceeding the national defense budget. This debt spiral is funded by the relentless printing of more paper, hollowing out the purchasing power of citizens through inflation. The circular saw that once cut through foreign competition is now slicing through the retirement accounts, savings, and stability of the American public. The ultimate irony of financial history is that the currency built to dominate the world has become the instrument of its own confinement. When you build a system on enforced debt, you eventually discover that the most expensive thing to maintain is the illusion that the debt will ever be paid. The dollar did not conquer the world because it was strong. It conquered because the world had no second door to walk through. But once that door is found, the saw begins to cut the other way. This leaves us with a difficult question. Will the weaponization of the dollar system ultimately protect American hegemony, or will it prove to be the exact catalyst that ends it? The ledger of history is shifting, and your perspective on where it lands matters to me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.